realized that the shift that was taking place with regard to the relationship between East and West, Soviet Union and the United States, something was seriously amiss. And that summer, the coup had occurred in Moscow, Russia, which led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of a seeming communist, global communist threat. That what was essentially going on was a big lie, that the Moscow was feigning the collapse of communism or as a part of a large-scale ruse to mislead the West, to wage what I call false peace, in order to instill a false sense of security in the United States and the Western world, so that we would slowly lower our guard and thus open the way eventually for a surprise Third World War. And so really over the course of the past almost 2 decades, the world has been grossly misled. And in the context of biblical prophecy, this is written about in 2 Thessalonians 2 in terms of God would send upon this world a strong delusion because people did not love the truth, but rather were busy having pleasure in unrighteousness. And that is what America and Western society and the world as a whole has been up to in the past couple decades like never before. I mean, these are definitely like the times of Noah. So the point with regard to 2 Thessalonians 2 is this has to do with the rise of the Antichrist. And in fact, what we see in Moscow has been the stage is being set. They got rid of communism, yes, but it was not to install liberal democracy and Western-style capitalism. Rather, if you follow history with a critical eye, you would be led, as I have, to the work of Alexander Yanov, who wrote a book called The Russian Challenge in the year 2000, back in the late 1980s, in which he forewarned that the Russians, the Soviets, were planning to get rid of communism to replace it with Christianity, orthodoxy. And what we see is that Russia has been immediately, once the communism was done away with, they started rebuilding and restoring Orthodox churches. The government spending billions and billions of supposedly scarce rubles to build up the Orthodox Church. And that's because they saw communism as sort of a forerunner in terms of the egalitarian ethos to the coming kingdom of God as they see it, except their idea of God's kingdom is that it will be the form of a totalitarian dictatorship, monarchy, if you will, but for all intents and purposes, it's truly a false kingdom of God and global tyranny that they're planning. The current the persona that seems to be the Antichrist in the context of how history's unfolding is Vladimir Putin, who I believe is actually the reincarnation of RasPUTIN. And for all intents and purposes, this what we're talking about is demonic forces, and right now the strong delusion of this world has to do with man has fallen into temptation and is being literally delivered to the evil one being the Antichrist. To get a sense of how this is playing out, just consider that Vladimir Putin came to power Boris Yeltsin resigned, and he came to power on December 31st, 1999, i.e. into January 1st, 2000, the beginning of the third millennium. Now, in the context of Christianity, a day is like 1,000 years to the Lord, and 1,000 years is like a day. So, in the context of Christianity, the beginning of the third millennium has to do with the resurrection of Christ. And so Putin is literally is caught up in terms of how Moscow is fashioning history according to their idea that Russia's historical messianic calling is to create the kingdom of God on earth, where in the context of which they think that Moscow constitutes the third Rome. First Rome being Rome, the second Rome being Byzantine, and Moscow being the third Rome. But it's really, if you want to understand what it's about, it's more like Moscow being the Third Reich, because these guys are neo-fascist, totalitarian psychopaths for all intents and purposes, and they have nothing but the worst in mind for Western civilization. And that's why they've engaged in this telling the biggest lie in human history, is to set the stage for the largest act of premeditated mass murder in human history. And that's what I foresaw, i.e., first they're going to kick off a war against the Jews, Israel, in terms of Armageddon, which is actually Har-Megiddo, Megiddo being in northern Israel. So these prophecies are coming true with regard to World War III, and the apocalypse will kick off starting in the Middle East. And this will open the way for what has long been planned by Russia, i.e., a full-scale nuclear attack against the West and the United States and NATO, that will lead to the defeat of the Western world, the defeat of the free world, and allow the rise of the East to global dominance. And so, in the context of man's insanity, what I call the global bipolar disorder, this has to do with also swings between dominance of the Western and Eastern hemispheres of the world. For instance, with the Roaring '20s and the last peak, you had the peak of British and American dominance in the world, then the Great Depression, followed by World War II, and the rise of the Axis powers relative to the Allied powers, the rise of the totalitarian forces of the East relative to the libertarian forces of the West, and the low point of all that would have been really around 1942 as at the zenith of global dominance of the Eastern powers. So these wave patterns in terms of history are replaying, but now on a grand supercycle scale. We're still in the context of the peak of Western civilization, the dominance of Pax Americana and American empire on the global stage, but it is leading to the next major downswing that involves not only the economic and financial unwinding that's already underway, but ultimately the Third World War and the dominance of the East at the expense of the West, the rise of China and Russia, and the full, really, crash of Western civilization. And in the context of these cycles, I'm saying that the crash could very well take the form of what I foresaw, a nuclear Third World War, in which case the United States would be completely removed from the equation, and Russia and China will become the global dominant hegemons. Now, that's it for now. I'll be making more videos as time goes on, but I wanted to get this warning out here since we're perched above Dow 11,000, and we could be reversing into the grand supercycle crash at this point. And so bear in mind what I've just explained. If there's a chemical scud attack in Israel, then my prophetic vision is unfolding. If you're in the United States, I'm basically living in ground zero. You know, I've been trying to warn everybody for 20 years, but nobody's listening. once the missiles start to fly, all bets are off. You need to clear out, bug out, just pack your stuff and get the heck out of town, because history will never be the same. With regard to how one can have hope in the context of this, trust me, God's got a plan.